this lesson, which is lesson 5. We're just going to talk about Jesus Christ tonight. We're going to talk about the Lord and his earthly ministry. Schaff has a good section on this in volume 1, and I've pulled a couple of quotes from him to kind of discuss this. But I'll talk a little bit about, I was going to have an entire slide on like controversies and stuff, but we can kind of talk about that as we go through. And maybe I'll ask some of the controversial questions as we go along. And then, yeah, so every proper study of church history, I think, has to begin with a study of the life of Jesus Christ. Time and, I guess description would fail us to discuss the ministry of the Lord. If you go to Craig, can you get, I want you to read a passage for us as we get started. Let me pull it up. The Gospel of John. And can you go to John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. And could you read that for us?
Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Amen. So the purpose of our talk tonight is to really, this is not by any stretch exhaustive, and there's a lot that can be said about our Lord and his earthly ministry, but the real goal tonight is just to kind of outline his life and then talk about the significance of his life and, ultimately try to reinforce, as the creed says, that he came down from heaven for us and for our salvation, and that that's why we're studying this. I mean, all of church history comes back to Christ. It comes back to the life of our Lord and what he did for us on the cross and in the empty tomb, as well as the perfect life that he lived. And all else that we could potentially talk about in this course would be vain if who Jesus said he was and whom the gospel writers record him to be is not true. If the things we're going to talk about tonight are not historical fact or historical reality, then there's no point in us being here. So any proper study of church history, especially a believing study of church history, has to go back to the life of the Lord and to his ministry and what he did for us. And so you could say in some ways this is the single most important lesson that we will have in this study of church history. And so while we kind of laid some historical foundations the past few weeks, this is really the beginning. This really is the study of church history proper, talking about the life of our Lord. So with that, just a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about some of the sources of the historical person of Jesus. We're going to talk about his pre-existence, Advent, Annunciation, the Nativity. Talk about his childhood, his public ministry, his passion, his resurrection, as well as his ascension. And we will discuss issues related to these various topics as we go along. So with that, a couple of quotes. As I said, from the the beginning. All proper studies of church history must start with the life of our Lord. And quoting from Acts chapter 17, Paul's famous sermon on Mars Hill, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. For in him we move and we live and move and have our being. Schaff writes in Volume 1 of History of the Christian Church, page 82, Christ himself wrote nothing, but furnished endless material for books and songs of gratitude and praise. The living church of the redeemed is his book. He founded a religion of the living spirit, not of a written code like the Mosaic law. Yet his words and deeds are recorded by as honest and reliable witnesses as ever put pen to paper. What do you guys think of that quote?
The testimony is powerful, more powerful than, I guess, pen and paper, I guess.
Yeah. It's really true. Christ did not pen any autobiographical details. Everything that we have of him is written by somebody else. We talked about Socrates a couple of weeks ago, and we don't have any of the words that Socrates ever wrote or said from Socrates' own pen. We have only what his students and his disciples said about him. In a similar and greater fashion, we don't have any autobiographical material from Christ. Everything that we have is contained in sources written by somebody else. And it's the job of the historian to ascertain the historical credibility, but it is the job of the Christian to understand the purpose and nature of these letters and works that attest to his life. And it is our job as apologists to defend the veracity of the history that we have, because ours is a historical faith. It is not a faith of myth or fable or fancy, but we have a faith that is grounded in actual events that actually happened in history. And so we have to be able to critically evaluate our sources and understand that the books that we have in the New Testament didn't just fall out of the sky, that they were composed, that they have literary genre, and there is a criticism that can be applied to them. But we also have to understand that this is the Word of God as well. And so there's a balance in that. On the one hand, we are not like Mormons or Mohammedans who have a book that essentially descends out of heaven, and we just sort of incredulously believe that book. But on the other hand, we don't act the way that skeptics do today and just try to be as critical as we can and come to the books with presuppositions that would not allow for the events that are recorded to be possible, because we have a supernatural faith. History is not like mathematics. It's not like chemistry. It's not like other sciences. So there is a sense in which we have to be careful in the way that we analyze things. But that being said, we can't come to these sources with the presuppositions of a naturalistic materialist. It's not who we are, and so our faith is not founded merely upon historical facts, even though those are crucial to what we believe. But it's how we interpret those historical events and what lens and what worldview and what presuppositions we're bringing to the table that I think defines what is believing Christianity from what is skepticism and infidelity. So,
Hey, Richard,
yeah.
one thing back to the Gospel of John that you had me read from. I remember Jesus was talking with the apostles and said he would bring to remembrance things that he said to them. So even in the apostles' ministry, as you know, Jesus had a speaking ministry, he didn't write, but the Holy Spirit came and would remind them of things he said, so that when they ministered, both in their spoken word as well as what they wrote, the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit was very active in that.
Yeah. No, great point, Craig. Absolutely. That even though the Gospels contain actual history, um, it's not merely naturalistic history, that the Holy Spirit is still alive and working in his people today. Maybe not in the exact same sense that he did to in the lives of the apostles to inspire um, sacred writ, but our Lord is alive, and that's the whole purpose of why we're here. So here's a great quote that I found on the internet about Jesus from somebody living many centuries later. He says, I know men, and I tell you, Jesus Christ was not a man. And I think what the emperor means by this is that he is not merely a man. Superficial minds see a resemblance between Christ and the founders of empires and the gods of other religions. That resemblance does not exist. There is between Christianity and other religions the distance of infinity. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and myself founded empires. But on what did we rest the creations of our genius? Upon sheer force. Jesus Christ alone founded his empire upon love. And at this hour, millions of men will die for him. In every other existence but that of Christ, how many imperfections! From the first day to the last, he is the same, majestic and simple, infinitely firm and infinitely gentle. He proposes to our faith a series of mysteries and commands with authority that we should believe them, giving no other reason than those tremendous words, I am God. This was penned by the French Emperor Napoleon, Napoleon Bonaparte. As you can see, him in his royal robes, harkening back to much Roman iconography as well as medieval iconography as well. He has his grass crown here, which is actually made of gold. He has his eagle scepter. He has his orb here, which signifies the world, and then obviously the cross here. Napoleon was a skeptic for much of his life until the very end. Whether or not he passed into eternity as a truly regenerate Christian, that is only for the Lord to know. But he certainly had taken a very different view of Christianity than the French Revolution had during his own lifetime. So I find this a very profound statement from one of the most significant figures, at least in the modern era, that he recognizes that everything that he did paled in comparison, both in kind and in degree, to what Jesus did. Napoleon today is just a historical afterthought, whereas the religion that Christ founded continues to the heartbeat of that religion continues to beat even to this day, over 2 centuries after the lifetime of Napoleon. So, sources for Jesus's life. These can be roughly divided into Christian sources and non-Christian sources. For Christian sources, we have the 4 canonical Gospels, as well as our Pauline epistles, the Catholic epistles, which would be like James and Jude, 1st and 2nd Peter. We also have works from the early church fathers, which we will talk about as we get into ante-Nicene Christianity. People like Polycarp and Tatian and Papias and Clement and the Didache, these other, very early works that were written within living memory of the lifetimes of the apostles, who obviously wrote within living memory of the time of Christ. And then we also have apocryphal works, and I include these under quote unquote Christian sources because I'm using the term Christian kind of in a technical academic sense here, not in a strict believing sense of the word. And so there are many apocryphal works starting in the 2nd century about the life of Christ. And while they may not provide us much in the way of direct historical evidence of who Jesus is, they kind of form a mirror of the genuine gospels and the genuine epistles to basically show what is a fraud and what is not. And so those are our Christian sources. And then we actually do have, contrary to our crazy skeptics out there, some non-Christian sources from within living memory of the life of Christ. Now, some of these are disputed, but others of them are not. And so you can actually read some of these. Actually, let me pull up some of these. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Just to go back on the other page, was Napoleon, he wrote that towards the end of his life in his biography, that quote?
Yeah, so that was recorded of Napoleon when he was living on, I believe, was it St. Helena? It was an island in the South Atlantic that he had been banished to after he was finally defeated at Waterloo. He surrendered to the British, and he was basically banished to this small rock in the South Atlantic to live out the rest of his days.
Okay.
All right, so I have a source here. This is from Tacitus, or we would say Tacitus in our modern day English. So he wrote an entire history called the Annals. He was writing in the late 1st century, and he records a lot of different events from the late Republican era up through the early Imperial era. And he has a very interesting story here, talking about the Great Fire in Rome, which took place in AD 64, when there was a fire that broke out and consumed much of the city. And this actually became the impetus for persecution of the Christians. And so, writing on this persecution, he says this: "But all human efforts, all lavish gifts of the emperor," that's the Emperor Nero, "and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order." So a little bit of background here. There's this fire that breaks out in July of 64 AD in the city of Rome. It consumes probably 3/4 of the city. And a lot of people were left destitute. A number of people had died. And it broke out in a quarter of the city that was not far away from where the emperor was building what was called his Domus Aureus, his great golden house. And so suspicion began to arise within the city of Rome that perhaps the emperor had actually set fire to the city, or at the very least took advantage of this situation to allow these districts of the city close to where he had planned to build his house to burn down so that he could seize the property and enlarge his estate within the city of Rome. And so the people were grumbling against the emperor because he was the one that was suspected of actually setting the fire. The whole, proverbial saying of Nero fiddled while Rome burned is a reference to this event. And so the emperor's under a lot of pressure, and Nero needs a scapegoat to redirect the anger of the citizens from himself. And so Tacitus writes, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, But even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular, accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of the firing of the city as of hatred against mankind. So, what are some things you guys notice about this quote?
Well, persecution is certainly evidence here from a non-Christian perspective. So it's just confirmation.
Yeah, yeah. What about
And confirm some of the historical detail, like Pontius Pilate and
uh-huh.
that Jesus Christ was convicted and crucified.
Yeah. So the extreme penalty, this is a euphemism of crucifixion. Crucifixion was so horrific that many Romans, especially nobility, wouldn't even mention the word. And so the extreme penalty, I mean, it's the worst kind of death that a criminal could die. Um, he refers to in this euphemistic form. But what are some other things that you notice? Some of the names, the historical details. So this could be our first mention. We mentioned last week Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan, and how Pliny the Younger had written about the practices of Christians. And so it was our first sort of external source that mentioned what Christians do. This is our potentially our first external source about using the name or using the word Christians. Um, and notice what he calls Jesus. Does this word look familiar?
Christ. Christos.
Yes, so Christus. This is our first use of that. So the Latin for Christ, which is Greek Christos, which is the translation of the Hebrew Messiah. So Christians are already known for calling Jesus Christ by the pagans. What about this word right here? Does this ring a bell from last week?
Mm.
Remember, Roman religion, even though it was not necessarily centralized, you had to kind of have approval for whatever rites were done. And what was unapproved religion called in the Roman Empire and in Roman civilization?
Superstition.
Superstitio. Yes, that's right. So we already have a reference to potential the idea that the Christians are not just an ethnic group, but there is a religious element to what they are doing. And so their religion and Christianity is already being called a superstition in the first century by our external Roman writers. All right. Any other questions about some of the sources? I'll mention Josephus and his Antiquities. There is a source that is more disputed than the reference in Tacitus, but most people think it is uh, uh, reliable. So, Book 18 of his Antiquities, there is a discussion, as well as in Book 20 of Jesus. There's this curious letter about called Mara Bar Serapion. So bar is the Aramaic word for son. So this is an Aramaic work coming, I believe, from the city of Edessa or somewhere over there. There's another disputed work. But it's apparently a Stoic philosopher who is referring to the Jews and the reason they suffered the punishment that they did in the aftermath of the First Jewish-Roman War. And the Stoic philosopher, probably from northern Syria, southern Asia Minor, basically said that they had crucified the Messiah that had been sent to them. And so it's kind of an obscure reference, but of disputed authenticity. But some people, and a number of academics, actually think this is a legitimate reference because he seems to have no dog in the fight between Christians and Jews, and he's just kind of mentioning the reason why the Jews suffered. Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars and his description of Claudius, he has a reference to Jesus and Christians. The Talmud as well, which comes from a couple of centuries later, but some of these traditions in the Talmud are actually concerning this evil figure whom the Jews call Yeshu, which it's essentially an acronym pronouncing damnation upon Jesus. But Yeshu is a pejorative diminutive for Yeshua, which we know is the Hebrew name for Jesus. And then there's a number of other sources. We mentioned the Pliny the Younger letter, Talus, Phlegon of Tralles, Philo may comment on Jesus. There's this legend of him meeting Peter, as well as an early 2nd century opponent of Christianity in Celsus, who mentions Christians and their practices. All right, any questions? All right, we'll continue on. So the pre-existence. The New Testament is pretty clear that Jesus did not begin as a baby in Bethlehem, but that he pre-existed his earthly life. Here are a couple of quotes from the scriptures. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, who, although existing in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and being made in the likeness of men. And then Colossians 1, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So what do these passages indicate about Christ's origin?
Ancient of Days.
How did the early Christians view Jesus and who he was in the literature that we have, in the canonical scriptures?
God a mere man.
Yeah. As Napoleon said, he was not just a man or not a mere man, but there was from the very beginning, a recognition that the person of Jesus, that he pre-existed his birth in Bethlehem. So much so that there are lofty terms like existing in the form of God. He was in the beginning with God, that, the Word was God, using these titles for him. And we'll get into those as we kind of get into our study of the New Testament and into, ante-Nicene Christianity and start talking about some of the controversies. But this is the exalted language that is being used of him already within just 20 or 30 years of the end of his earthly ministry. And so with that, we now come to the Advent. And I love this quote. Schaff actually quotes Galatians 4:4 in discussing the coming of Christ. He says, "But when the fullness of time, the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law." So the world at the advent of Christ was a world largely at peace due to the career of Caesar Augustus. So did people from last week remember who is Caesar Augustus?
You mean like the first of the line of Caesars?
Yeah, so who was Caesar Augustus? What did he do?
Octavian.
Conquer the known world.
Yeah, in a sense, you're right, Jonah. At the very least, he unified what was the Roman world. He defeated all of his rivals and he established the empire that Rome had transitioned from its republican form of government into its imperial form of government. And so he had essentially achieved a peace that had been unknown in the late Republic. And so this was the age of the Pax Romana, the great Roman peace. This is a feature of Roman religion that Schaff discusses, that the gates of Janus were closed, signifying that Rome was at peace. The god Janus, who we get our month of January from, he's kind of the two-faced god because he looks both forward and backwards. And so he looks both to the future as well as to the past. And there's significance at his temple in Rome that whenever the gates were open, that meant that Rome was at war. And for most of Roman imperial history and even into the Republican era, the gates were open. But Augustus symbolically closed the gates upon his accession, signifying that the world had finally come to peace under Caesar Augustus. And so it was into this peace that God sent forth our peace. But in spite of the pomp that Augustus had with the celebration, not everything was well. In Judea, which was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire under Herod the Great, it was made a province directly under Roman rule in 6 AD after the disastrous rule of Herod the Great's son, Herod Archelaus. I love this quote from Macrobius in his Saturnalia talking about Herod, that it is better to be Herod's pig than to be his son. Does anybody have any idea what this might be a reference to?
Because he killed practically everyone in his family.
Yes, that's true. Herod the Great killed much of his family. And because he was Jewish, that means he was kosher, which meant that he didn't eat pigs. And so it was safer to be a pig in the palace of Herod than it was to be one of Herod's own sons. So you can imagine after he died, Archelaus and Philip, and there was one other brother, I think there were three of them, who divided Herod's kingdom between each other. They, let's just say they took they inherited their father's paranoia, and Archelaus in particular was a rather brutal and sort of tyrannical, in the Eastern king sort of sense of the term, tyrant. And he so bungled the governance of the client kingdom that eventually the people actually cried out to Caesar himself to rid them of Herod as their king. And so Judea was brought directly under Roman rule in 6 AD. And so the people were chafing under the cruel rule of this puppet king, and who was a puppet king of a foreign imperial power. And so they were waiting and praying for a deliverer. And so here is a map of Judea in 6 AD at the time of its transition from a Roman province or from a client kingdom into a Roman province. Something to notice about the borders, though. What is not included in Judea? What is not included in this Roman imperial province that is significant to our story today?
I see Bethlehem in there.
I'm giving you guys a hint.
Oh, the sea? Or no, I do see the Sea of the Galilee. Never mind.
Yeah, so, well, you're on the right track, Tori. So this is Roman imperial territory right here that is directly under the rule of the empire. What about this territory up here?
I think it's known as Northern Israel, right? Samaria, maybe? Or
So you have Nazareth and Tiberias and the Sea of Galilee. Are these ringing a bell? So this is significant when we get to the portion of the Passion. Galilee was still being ruled as part of a client kingdom during the lifetime of Jesus, whereas Judea is under direct imperial rule. And so there's a lot that can be said there, especially as it relates to the census of Quirinius as well as the Passion. But remember during the Passion, was Pilate the only person to interrogate Jesus during his trial?
No, the church leaders.
Uh-huh. Well, there's one other individual beyond them, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but you're on the right track. So, yes.
Herod?
What was that?
Herod?
Yeah. Yeah. We'll get to that in a little bit. So, the Annunciation. There are two stories that we have in the gospel narratives, one from the Gospel of Luke and then one from the Gospel of Matthew, in which the birth of Christ or his conception is announced prior to his birth. And so the angel Gabriel in the first chapter of Luke appears to Mary in Nazareth during the 6th month of the pregnancy of her relative Elizabeth, who was pregnant with her son, John. Which John is this? Do we know which John this is from Scripture?
One whom Jesus loved.
Baptist?
Yeah,
Baptist.
different. Yeah, what Craig said. This is John the Baptist. Remember, he was a relative. He was a cousin of Jesus. His mother, Elizabeth, was a relative of Mary. And so John was born about 6 months prior to the time of Jesus. And so the angel Gabriel comes to Mary in Nazareth and announces the conception of Jesus. So this is what is called the Annunciation. So Mary questions Gabriel as she is a virgin, but Gabriel answers her with how it would happen and gives this final benediction: for nothing will be impossible with God. So from the gospel sources that we have, how was Jesus conceived? Was he conceived in the normal way?
Nope.
Oh, virgin.
Yeah, his mother was a virgin, and the Gospels are pretty consistent on this. And this echoes back to which Old Testament book that we like to read at Christmas time?
Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah. I believe it's Isaiah chapter 7. Is that right, Craig?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it's the Alma, the young maiden in Hebrew, which is translated Parthenos in the Septuagint, bringing us back to a couple of our earlier lessons, that the Parthenos, the virgin, would be with child, as Matthew quotes from Isaiah. And so the Feast of the Annunciation, which is celebrated in a lot of the more liturgical churches, is actually coming up on March 25th. And that is 9 months prior to Christmas Day in the traditional Western calendar. Interestingly enough, J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings and the Middle-earth Legendarium, in his timeline of the Return of the King, he actually has Frodo destroying, well, essentially Gollum biting Frodo's ring finger off and falling into the cracks of doom and destroying the ring accidentally. That actually happens on March 25th in Tolkien's narrative. And the reason that Tolkien did that is he thought that it would be quite fitting that the evil kingdom of the Dark Lord Sauron would be overthrown on the 25th of March, because this is the Feast of the Annunciation, which is when the world turned from darkness to light, where the light of God had come into the world. And so March 25th is the traditional date that is celebrated for the Feast of the Annunciation. Moving from the Annunciation, we come to the next part of the story, and that is the Nativity story. So can y'all maybe call out what are some of the features that are traditionally associated with the Nativity?
Star of David, 3 wise men,
Mm-hmm.
shepherds.
Yep.
The Persian astrologists, I think, or astronomers.
Yeah. Yeah. So there they are, right there on their camels, right? We have the Nativity star here, the Star of the Nativity. And there was no room for them in the inn, and so they're in the, sort of out there in the barn. A lot of this is tradition and not necessarily how it would have happened. What
Mhm.
about here? Here's maybe a manger right here, which a manger was not a trough for food. A manger was a trough for water. So there wouldn't have been any straw or hay in the manger. And then, of course, we have the cow and the donkey here, obviously bowing reverently as well. Um, so this peaceful sort of scene that we kind of have from postcards, it's not necessarily how it would have happened. So I'm going to take us to the year and talk about some of the historiography here, because we all have read the nativity stories from Matthew and Luke in the scriptures. And now those do give us some interesting clues. But the year that we think this happened is the year of Christ's birth. We actually think it's probably somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. So Christ was born before Christ. So the way that we arrive at this is we relate the death of Herod, which Josephus and others sort of universally confined to 4 BC. Now, would they have called it BC in their day when they're writing about the death of Herod? Does anybody remember the dating system that we used or that we discussed last week when we were talking about ancient Rome? Anno Urbe Condita, AUC. So yeah, they would have used the dating system AUC, which is what the Romans used when they're writing about these events, whether it be Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius, any of the sort of Roman writers. And so we know when Herod died. They all seem to be pretty consensed upon. I believe it was 749 AUC, which 753 BC was year 1 AUC. So subtract the difference, 753, 749, and you're left with 4 BC as the year that Herod died. Given that the slaughter of the infants in Bethlehem, it was from everyone who was 2 years old and younger, you can maybe carry that back to about 6 BC as kind of an early range for when Jesus was born. So he was born somewhere in this time period. The traditional date of 1 AD that we have typically, or that has traditionally been assumed, which actually hasn't really traditionally been assumed because we knew that Dionysius actually got it wrong pretty early on. This was calculated by a 6th century monk, Dionysius Exiguus. And we know that 1 AD is not actually the year that Jesus was born because of Herod's death, the census of Quirinius, all these other sort of details that tell us that Jesus was actually born a few years before this. The Star of the Magi, this is really interesting what Schaff talks about. There's sort of 2 prevailing, overarching theories as to what this could be. I always assumed as a kid, this would be like a supernatural phenomenon, that something God just did, whether it was an angel or something like that, that the Magi would have been following. But Schaff talks about some very interesting possibilities, that sometimes God uses natural phenomenon to communicate with us. And so there's this very interesting astronomical calculation that I highly recommend you guys go read in History of the Christian Church, page 104, where Johannes Kepler, who is the great, I believe it was Dutch astronomer writing around 1600, brilliant mathematician and astronomer. We name stuff in NASA after Kepler. That he actually calculated that there is a triple conjunction of the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in the year 7 to 6 BC. And this would have been very bright, traveling from the east, heading towards the west. And so this is one potential possibility. There's another planetary alignment that happened in 6 BC between Jupiter, Saturn, and the Sun. And there's also some thoughts that maybe there were some nova or, Halley's Comet or something like that could have been in the sky around this time. So there's actually some pretty intriguing possibilities that perhaps the Star of Bethlehem was in fact some sort of natural phenomenon. And of course, who was following the star but the Magi? So the Magi, just for your knowledge, when we sing "We Three Kings of Orient Are," were the Magi kings?
No.
No, they were not. What were the Magi?
Astronomers?
In a sense. So a magus, this was a Greek term that was taken from ancient Persian languages. A magus, we actually know what religion they would have practiced and where they would have come from. They likely came when Jesus was around 2 years old, and perhaps not all at once. The magus was a Zoroastrian priest. And so we know that they came from Parthia or ancient Persia. That was Rome's sort of rival to the east. And so the Parthian Empire at this time was ruled by the Shahanshah, the king of kings, as the Persians like to call their rulers. And the religion was the religion of Zoroaster or Zarathustra. So Zoroastrianism was the state religion of ancient Iran, which I prefer the term Iran to Persia, but that's a different story. Iran is actually a more broad term. And so Zoroastrianism was an ancient Iranian dualistic religion in which Ahura Mazda, which is the wise lord in the Avesta, which is their holy book, was worshipped as the chief deity. And so this religion was founded by the quasi-legendary Zarathustra, which that would have been his Persian name. The Greeks called him Zoroaster, who lived from the late 7th to the early 6th century BC. So this is a very ancient religion. And there was a lot in Zoroastrianism related to astrology, and it had picked up influences from Babylonian religion. And so we actually know who the Magi were, at least in terms of where they came from and what class they would have filled. So they were priests of this religion called Zoroastrianism. And when it says they're coming from the east, they're coming from Persia. They're coming from, maybe Babylon, but somewhere within the Parthian Empire, because they are Magi. They hold the title of Magus within the Zoroastrian religion. And so that's another historical detail. There's about 100,000 Zoroastrians alive today. And can anybody think of a famous Zoroastrian? I'll put this on the screen for you guys. This is too cool. I should have had this as a slide.
Do they have a car called a Mazda?
That's probably where that comes from.
I'm really curious now.
Does anybody recognize? Let me see if I can pull them up. Let me pull up the picture. Oh, I should have totally had this. Should have totally had this in the slide PowerPoint. Let me copy this real quick and actually insert a slide for our folks at home. This is too cool. All right, come on, Jonah. Fan of 80s rock at all? We Are the Champions.
The Queens, man.
Yeah, who was the lead singer in Queen? Freddie Mercury.
I want you to play it. I want you to play
Yeah,
it.
so does anybody know what religion Freddie Mercury belonged to?
No.
Only
So
Zoroastrianism.
He was a Zoroastrian. His
Wow.
family were from India, but they were descended from Iranian refugees who, after the Muslim conquest, moved to India. And so Freddie Mercury was actually a Zoroastrian, and he was buried in a Zoroastrian fire temple. So, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
There's your connection to the Magi. So Freddie
Wow.
Mercury, the lead singer of Queen, was actually a Zoroastrian, and because of British colonialism in India, I think his family was in like Uganda or something. They were Indians who had moved to Uganda, and then from there moved to the UK. And so, yeah, Freddie Mercury, you're the world's most famous Zoroastrian, besides the three wise men from the Christmas story.
Wow. I have
I think
never heard of that religion until today.
Was that the religion that had those ziggurats or something, or no? Is that something
That's
different?
Babylonian religion, which is
Okay.
distinct from Iranian religion. Certainly, the two religious traditions influenced each other because of the close proximity between Babylon and Persia. But those would be distinct religions. So, yeah, there's Freddie Mercury singing away. So, there's our connection to the Christmas story. So, moving on from the Christmas story. Jesus, his family escapes from Herod. Herod dies, and then they return after the death of Herod to Galilee in Nazareth, where his family was living. Galilee was a very interesting region for Jews. It was made up of people who were primarily descended from exiles, so people who had been exiled to Babylon and then came back into the land. There were a number of Jews who decided to settle in the northern part of the country. And so while both Galileans and Judeans were Jews, as we would call them today, they had a different accent and different traditions. And so his growing up in Galilee certainly had a major impact upon him, because all of his disciples, except for one, were Galileans, like he was. And so many of the great rabbis from this era came from Galilee and not from Judea. And so his earthly parents were Mary and Joseph. Joseph was called a carpenter, Matthew 13:55, which is an interesting Greek word, tekton, which is used in the Septuagint for kind of a general craftsman. So while we think of Jesus, you look at a movie like Ben-Hur and he's like building chairs and tables and that kind of stuff, because we think of carpentry as woodwork. His trade was actually probably more general than just woodworking. In fact, wood would have been very scarce in that part of the world at that time in history. And he probably would have worked more with stone than with wood. And so you can think of him more of as like a stonemason, would potentially be a more accurate term. And you think about all of the frequent references to stones or building with stones in the Gospels. Think about something like Matthew chapter 21:42, the stone which the builders rejected. that the term that we think of when Jesus is a carpenter, it's more general than that. He was a day laborer, and most of the building material they would have used in that day and age would have been stone instead of wood. We have. Is there a question? All
Sorry, I
right.
was clearing my throat.
Yep, no worries. So we only have one episode in the canonical Gospels from Jesus's childhood, and this is found in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. This is when Christ and his family are in Jerusalem for one of the great feasts, and Mary and Joseph load up the caravan, and they're getting ready to head from Jerusalem back up to Nazareth. And what do you know? They can't find their son. And so they end up going back to Jerusalem, and they find Jesus at just 12 years of age, astonishing the rabbis in the temple with his teachings and with his answers to their questions. And so it kind of is a shock to them that he is, with the most learned men in the entirety of Judaism, and he is confounding them and astonishing them with his answers. And so they pack their bags after they are kind of a little spooked. I would probably be a little spooked if I was Mary and Joseph in that situation. And they make their way back to Nazareth. And it says that Jesus continued increasing in wisdom and stature. The apocryphal gospels are full of what I would consider often fantastical stories of Jesus' childhood. Some of them are quite blasphemous from our perspective, but they're trying to fill in the gap. And that's one of the clues that we'll get to when we talk about apostolic Christianity, of the authenticity of the canonical gospels, is the fact that oftentimes the apocryphal gospels, they clearly are coming from a later time, because they don't get the geography right, they don't get the division of the names right, and they're oftentimes trying to fill in the gaps from the earlier canonical gospels. So there's this story of the clay birds or the clay pigeons, where Jesus brings these pigeons that he had made of clay to life on the Sabbath. This is a story from the Arabic infancy gospel of Thomas, which is later retold in the Quran. And so much of, and we'll get to this when we talk about Islam, much of Islam's narratives of Jesus are actually coming from these apocryphal works rather than the canonical scriptures. There's a story of the broken water jug, where he spreads his cloak out and carries the water home. There's one where he's, building a bed with his dad, and there's a beam that's a wooden beam that's really short, and he miraculously lengthens this wooden beam. There's a story of a young boy who falls from a roof and then dies, and so Jesus raises him up in order to be cleared of suspicion for killing this boy. And then there's the really blasphemous story where he kills a boy who drains his water pool and blinds his neighbors, who then complain to Joseph. So these are just some of the crazy stories that you find in the apocryphal gospels, that are trying to fill in the gaps. But we only really know one story about Jesus' childhood, and that is this episode in the temple. And so finally, after about 18 or so years, Christ has grown up, and he begins his public ministry. And here is a timeline from one particular website. I don't necessarily agree with the dates here, but this is using the traditional date of 33 AD as the date of the crucifixion, and there's cleansing of the temple. Well, there's his baptism, his cleansing of the temple, the miracle in Cana, being rejected, his choosing of the disciples, Sermon on the Mount, then some of the parables that he tells, calming of the storm, feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, the transfiguration, and then obviously the events leading up to the passion. So Christ's ministry follows that of John the Baptist. And here's a little interesting tidbit from history. It says in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, now in the 15th year of the reign, that's the hegemonias, of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor in Judea, and Herod was tetrarch in Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene. So there's this interesting detail dating the ministry of John the Baptist from the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. Now, who was Tiberius Caesar? Does anybody remember from our lesson last week?
Tiberius was the philosopher king.
No, he was not a philosopher.
If I had to guess, was he the, I guess, well, my second guess is emperor, but my first guess is like, was he the leader of that region or something like that? Governor, maybe?
So does a governor take the title of Caesar?
No.
Here it is on his coin, Augustus. So Tiberius was the stepson of the Emperor Augustus. So Augustus had a couple of grandsons who predeceased him. They died when they were in childhood. And so he kept trying to have his own male relatives, be his heir, but they kept dying on him. And so he married a woman named Livia, who was married to a man by the name of Claudius Nero, which is a significant name. And Nero had two sons that Augustus adopted, Tiberius and his brother Drusus. And so Tiberius was Caesar Augustus's stepson. He and Augustus had a on again, off again stepson and stepfather relationship. But by the end of his life, after all of his other heirs had died, Augustus knew that Tiberius was at least competent. And so Tiberius was named his heir. What's interesting is that the word hegemonius is used, and Schaff talks about this. This is opposed to monarchia or basilia. So a monarchia, that's where we get our term monarch. That means sole ruler, or basilia means king, which was the term that would be used of Augustus. Hegemonius is a more general term for rule. And so there's several possibilities of dating when John the Baptist began his ministry based off of this phrase, 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. So one, we could go from Tiberius's sole rule when Augustus died in 14 AD. Tiberius assumes the imperial purple, and that would put the 15th year of Tiberius in 29 AD. Another possibility is when Tiberius was raised to co-princeps. So Augustus essentially made him co-Augustus in 13 AD in anticipation of Augustus's death, so a year earlier. And that would put the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry at 28 AD. There's another possibility that is mentioned, I believe it's Tacitus who talks about this, that after returning from campaign in Germania, Tiberius was given the co-rule over the provinces with Augustus. And so whether you take option 1, 2, or 3, this puts the date for John the Baptist's ministry sometime between 27 and 29 AD. And Jesus is baptized by John shortly thereafter. And so Jesus's earthly ministry begins within a matter of months after John's early ministry. And so that puts the date of Jesus's ministry sometime between 27 and 29 AD. Remember, we're thinking like historians in this lesson, not just, going off of what we have in the text by itself. Another clue that we have is actually from John chapter 2, verse 20. 46 years was this temple in building. So according to Josephus, Herod the Great began to rebuild the temple of Zerubbabel. So that's the second temple that the Jews built after they returned from the Babylonian exile under Cyrus the Great. And so he began to rebuild the temple in the 18th year of his reign. So that would be, and specifically around the time of Passover. So that would be the month of Nisan in ancient Jewish reckoning, either in the year 734 or 735, ab urbe conditia, or 734 to 735 AUC. That would be approximately 20 BC. So that means that this first Passover year in the Gospels would be the year 28. And so there's the first Passover mention would be in the year 28 AD. That means that this would be the spring after Jesus's baptism in the year 27 AD. And so the language that's used here is actually implying that the temple was still under construction and it wasn't actually completed until Herod Agrippa in 64 AD. But we actually have a pretty good idea, and this is the date that I favor, that I believe that Jesus's ministry started in 27 AD, and that he's celebrating the first Passover that we see in the Gospel of John in the year 28 AD. Any questions? It's interesting how you have these little clues in there that we can kind of externally verify.
I wanted to ask a question back to that Zoroaster, where the three magi.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the significance of that? That they weren't really believers in the old covenant, and yet they come to see Jesus. What do you get from that?
Well, you got to remember, ancient religion was more eclectic. And Jews had been living in the domains of what was Greater Persia or Greater Iran for over 500 years at this point. And so Jews would have been very well known to Zoroastrians. And so Zoroastrianism, which is kind of interesting, unlike religion in the Greco-Roman world, where there was no sort of unified, organized religion, the Persians had actually unified and organized their religion. And so you had a state religion, Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism it's kind of, there were still sort of pre-Zoroastrian Iranian traditions. So Mithras, which we'll talk about in the ante-Nicene period, the sort of cult of Mithra that a lot of people say, oh, well, the Bible is just ripping off the cult of Mithra. That's nothing could be further from the truth. So Mithraism is the god Mir or Miran, which would have been a pre-Zoroastrian Iranian deity. So there was some element of polytheism, but Ahura Mazda was almost worshipped in a monotheistic fashion by the Zoroastrians. And so since the Jews were monotheistic as well, there was some sort of cultural exchange that occurred between the Jews and the Persians. And so you possibly would have had Persians going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem to come see the great feast, or their merchants or something of that nature. So there were still connections between Judea and the clearly large Jewish population that was living outside of the Roman Empire within the Parthian kingdom. And so it's not entirely implausible that you would have Zoroastrian priests, especially who see an astrological sign, and there's astrology within Zoroastrian religion, to see a sign like this and take it as a sign from the heavens, to go see what this great sign was about. So I think there's a number of different threads or connections that you could draw between the Zoroastrian priests and the nativity story. So that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it's just something I really never thought of. It's just that's the interesting thing about these church history lessons is we're covering things you don't normally think of, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, but it's great because you really do see the historical character of the faith. Like, this is not a myth. This is not the Book of Mormon, guys. We're not talking about
Yeah.
made up places.
It makes us so much more rich. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yes.
it's goes beyond our comprehension.
Yeah. And like I said, even these couple of phrases that are just found in the canonical gospel, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, 40 and 6 years was this temple in building. We can use these phrases and corroborate with external sources and say, hey, we actually kind of know what years Jesus and John the Baptist would have been in public ministry. And it's I think incredible to see that we can determine all this, all these, thousands of years later. All right. Any additional questions before we continue on?
I don't have questions, but I have a comment on that thread. I did a quick Google, and the Mazda car company, which is originated in Japan, is named after Ahura Mazda, which is kind of odd for a Japanese company, and they have no technical relation to Zoroastrianism, but the founder's name, when put in like Western phonetic spelling, resembles Mazda.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's why they chose it.
Wow. So the Mazda car company is connected in some way to the nativity story.
Yes.
That's a great thread. I like it.
I do too.
Excellent. Well, we will continue on. So this is the beginning of Jesus's ministry. And his ministry, of course, begins with his baptism and his temptation. So we have three direct accounts of the baptism of Jesus found in Matthew chapter 3, Mark chapter 1, Luke chapter 3. And there's an allusion to the baptism in the Gospel of John chapter 1, 25 through verse 34. And all of them, we have these facts. Jesus is baptized by his relative John. So John the Baptist, who's his cousin, or, whether second, third cousin, we don't necessarily know, but Elizabeth is a relative of his mother Mary, so this is his kinsman. This is his distant cousin or his relative. So he's baptized by John. The Spirit descends upon Jesus, and the Father speaks of his beloved Son in whom he is well pleased. In Mark's account, it's rather interesting. There's a very unusual word for the opening of the heavens. It's schizomenos, which is a rather vivid word, which literally says that the heavens were ripped apart or torn open. And there's this great light as the Spirit is descending as a dove. And so it forms a verbal thread with the end of Jesus's public ministry and the Passion, when the temple veil is torn, or eschithe, so it's the same root in Mark chapter 15, verse 38. And so Mark is kind of using these two variants of the same word to kind of say this is when Jesus's ministry begins, and this is when his earthly ministry closes with his death and the Passion. So as soon as the baptism is done, and this is the traditional site of Jesus's baptism in the country of Jordan, just east of Israel in the West Bank. It's called Al-Magtas. That's the Arabic name. This is historically Bethany beyond the Jordan, or Bethabara. Those are the two words that are used in the New Testament to describe where Jesus was baptized. And so they've actually excavated this site that seems to be connected with a site of baptism. And so you'll have thousands of Christian pilgrims will make their way to Jordan every year. And the king, even though he's a Muslim, he's probably the most tolerant Muslim ruler in the Middle East, and so they actually have a native Christian population in Jordan, and so the king is the custodian for all of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in the Holy Land, and so this is a site that is maintained by the government of Jordan, and so like popes and patriarchs and lots of people have been here to get baptized in the Jordan River. So go to this place and book your trip and go see some of the sites. So after Jesus's baptism, the three synoptic gospels universally attest to the temptation of Christ by Satan. So Matthew chapter 4, Mark chapter 1, and Luke chapter 4. So he spends 40 days in the Judean desert on a water only fast. And then there are three different temptations. And it's interesting. Does anybody know the funny or the interesting little tidbit about the temptations, like the order of the temptations?
Y'all are from Deuteronomy, says answer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. He quotes from Deuteronomy. So the order of the temptations is actually recorded differently in the canonical Gospels. So I believe in Matthew we have the order of he turns the temptation to turn stones into bread. Man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, from Deuteronomy. The temptation to cast himself off the pinnacle of the temple. So, Satan quotes from the Psalms, he will bear you up on wings of angels. And he says, thou shalt not put the Lord your God to the test. And then there's the temptation to rule the kingdoms of the world. You shall worship and serve, depart from me, Satan. You shall worship and serve the Lord your God alone, also from Deuteronomy. Well, in the Gospel of Luke, it's actually reversed. The temptation turns the stones and the bread. That's still number one, but the second two temptations are actually reversed. It's the temple pinnacle one that's actually the third temptation. But that is something we'll get into when we'll talk about the Gospels. We'll talk about the synoptic problem or the problem in quotes. But I think what it attests to is the veracity of the account, because each author is kind of giving his own take, his own point of view on the events as they were happening. So that means they weren't just all in cahoots making it up together. After his baptism and his temptation, Jesus then proceeds to choose the 12 disciples. And so we have three accounts in the Synoptic Gospels: Matthew chapter 10, Mark chapter 3, Luke chapter 6. And the 12, Simon Peter is always listed as first. His brother Andrew, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who are also probably relatives of Jesus. Which is probably why from the cross Jesus commends his mother's care to John, because John was the only male disciple who was there. And given that Jesus's brothers were not believing in him, John would have been the next of kin. There's Philip, Bartholomew, which is interesting. He's mentioned only in the synoptic accounts. Whereas there is a different name in the Gospel of John, and that is Nathaniel. And we'll get to that in a second. There's Thomas, doubting Thomas. There's Levi, who is called Matthew, who is a tax collector or a publican. There was James, the son of Alphaeus, Judas Thaddeus, who is the son of James, Simon the Zealot. So he would have actually been part of the extremist faction of Jews who wanted to throw the Romans out of the land. And then always listed last, and the only Judean, all the rest of them were from Galilee, but only one Judean, and that was Judas Iscariot, probably from the city of Kerioth in Judea, which would have been where the surname would have come from. So Nathaniel is interesting. He's only mentioned in John. He is typically identified with Bartholomew in the synoptic accounts. And Bartholomew's mentioned only in the synoptics and Acts, and he's not mentioned in John. What's interesting is the name Bartholomew, if you know your Hebrew and your Aramaic, in this case, roots, this is actually a surname. It means son of Ptolemy or son of the furrows. Bartholomew is probably not his first name. It's probably, just what he was known by, because sometimes you'd be just called son of whatever. Nathaniel was probably his given name, because that's a more conventional Judean first name or Jewish first name. Does anybody know does anybody kind of recognize anything about the 12, like their names?
A couple of them have the same name.
A couple of them do have the same name. Yep.
Did you say John was related to Christ biologically?
Yeah,
Or
his mother was probably related to Mary, Salome. We'll get into that at a different point,
I mean,
not this
some
lesson.
of them have like son of. They have like a son of often.
So,
Larger.
because we've anglicized a lot of these names, and this is something that if you're reading this from a Jewish perspective and you have a suspicion of Christianity, I've listened to a number of Jews who they read the Gospels and they're actually surprised to find out how Jewish the Gospels really are. Peter's name was not Peter, it was Simon or Simeon. I mean, it's Shimon in Hebrew. James is not James. That's how he anglicizes. It's Yaakov. It's Jacob. John is Yochanan. Nathaniel, Levi or Levi. Another Yaakov, Yehuda. Shimon again, Yehuda again. I mean, these are very Jewish names. Now, because of the influence of Hellenism, though, you have a few names like Andrew, which is from the Greek word for man. So a couple of the disciples, like Philip, we know Philip of Macedon, the king of Macedonia and Greece, who is Alexander the Great's father. So while you have a Jewish substratum, a Hebrew substratum, you very much also see this sort of, mixed up world that they would have lived in which Greek and Hellenistic influences have come in as well. And so while most of them have very Hebrew, very Jewish, very Old Testament names, a couple of them actually do also have Greek names as well. And so that just attests to the fact that this is a Jewish population that has lived under Greek rule for a very long time and is now of late come under Roman rule. And so it's just once again, attesting to the historical development and the historical context in which these men would have, lived their lives. We have a lot of Aramaic and Hebrew sort of idioms that find their way into the Gospels, but the Gospels are universally attested to being written in Greek. And so you have this very multicultural influence in some ways, but in other ways, it's a multicultural character to the story that fits exactly with the time period and the place that we're talking about. These are not made up names. These are real names of real men who actually existed at a particular point in history in a real place. And they're attesting to events that actually took place as well.
That was something in that video you sent me. The guy mentioned, right? Like it wasn't a believer, but he's like, he noticed, hey, this is very close to the time.
Yeah.
That Christ was there. The writings were consistent.
Yeah, you're talking about Tom Holland and that video that I sent. And I love Tom's work. I love his podcast series, The Rest is History. He's a dour agnostic because he's dour on his agnosticism, and he as our Lord says in his famous sayings, "You are not far from the kingdom of heaven," would be the way that I would describe Tom Holland, and I think he recognizes that himself. He was once a sort of virulent atheist agnostic who's now very sympathetic to the Christian story. So maybe we'll see his conversion at some point. But anyways, we press on. Only a few more slides left. Jesus's ministry, we'll talk about the length and the locations. It's understood to have taken place over an approximately 3.5-year period, primarily based on the number of times Jesus went to Jerusalem for the Passover. And there's some interesting theories on the length of his ministry in the patristic era. Irenaeus said it was 15 years, and that was because of his recapitulation theory of the atonement. We'll get to that in the ante-Nicene period. There were several other church fathers who said 1 year, so like Clement of Alexandria, based off of Isaiah 61, verse 2, which I believe Jesus quotes in the gospel, saying the acceptable year, singular, of the Lord. And there's only a mention of one Passover feast in the Synoptic Gospels. There are 3 Passovers mentioned in the Gospel of John, the first taking place in John chapter 2, the second in John chapter 6, and the third and final one in John chapter 11. His primary ministry location was in Galilee, cities like Nazareth, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin, Cana. Here's the Roman era ruins of Capernaum right here. Capernaum doesn't exist anymore. And then here's Nazareth, which is to this day a thriving and bustling city. It's actually called the Arab capital of Israel. Over 98% or 97% of the residents are Arabs, and it's a mixture of Muslims and Christians who live there. Historically, it was a Christian majority. It's become a Muslim majority in recent years because of a lot of Christian immigration from Israel to the West. But Nazareth is still there to this day, and I believe this is the Church of the Annunciation right there in the background. The Sea of Galilee is a common place in Jesus's ministry. Many of the stories that we read about are in the Sea of Galilee. And then also the site of Banias, which is named after, it's the Arabic equivalent of Panias, which is the ancient name of a city called Caesarea Philippi, which we read about in Matthew chapter 16. And there's some very interesting sort of language that Jesus uses. This was a site of worship to the Greek god Pan, who was a fertility deity in the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire. And this river, which is actually the Jordan River, used to rise up from under Mount Hermon in the north of Israel in the Golan Heights. This was actually referred to as the gates of Hades. And so when Jesus says the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church, he literally has taken his disciples up to a Gentile area in northern Israel and is saying the church is going to overthrow this pagan worship. And that this is illustrative or exemplary of the spiritual conquest that the church would have over the false gods of the world. But this is
Banias. Again, Richard? You're saying that the gates of hell will not prevail. That was a reference to what?
That was a reference to this site here in ancient Caesarea Philippi that we read about in Matthew chapter 16, where there is this is called the Rock of the Gods, but this is where the Greek god Pan, who was you see him, he's kind of like half man, half goat with like a little goat-like face and like, goat horns. He's like playing the flute. That's what we call it, the Pan flute. His worship was actually here in this Hellenized part of the Golan Heights. So a lot of Greek speakers lived here. And there was a temple to the god Pan here in Caesarea Philippi. And because the Jordan River flowed up from this spring, they thought this was the entrance to the underworld. And what was the underworld in Greek mythology known as? It was the realm of Hades. And so this was the gates of Hades. And so you can imagine Jesus somewhere over here and his disciples, how close did they get to this site of pagan worship? That's only speculation, but his disciples know this is a pagan land and a pagan area that he's taken them to. And he's saying, who do you say that I am? And you're the Christ, Son of the living God. And he says, blessed are you, Simon, son of John. For flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And I say to you that you're Peter, and upon Peter, upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not stand against it. And so, this is the site of Caesarea Philippi that Jesus would have taken the disciples to.
This is where he said that to Peter.
Yep.
Huh.
And that's in the
I would have
Golan
never
Heights.
known.
That same scripture, where it says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Is that a similar like quote scripture in context, or is that like
Jesus is drawing upon the actual location that he has taken the disciples and the false religion that would have been practiced in this location, and he is teaching a spiritual truth. The church was going to overcome the pagan worship that was happening in places like Caesarea Philippi.
Oh,
And because the local Greek speakers referred to this as the gates of Hades, because this is what they thought was an entrance to the underworld, it makes sense that Jesus would use that kind of imagery and that kind of language in this location.
yeah, I understand. It's cool.
Yeah. It's really cool. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, so Galilee was his primary spot of ministry. Jerusalem, Jesus is obviously doing ministry there, mainly with the feasts, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost, as well as obviously the Passover as well, and then Yom Kippur and Feast of the Trumpets. But we also have these other locations, the Decapolis, so the 10 cities. This is where he healed the Gadarene or the Gerasene demoniac, and then also Caesarea Philippi. And then Mount Tabor in Galilee is where the traditional site of the Mount of Transfiguration was, where Jesus and Peter and James and John go up on the mountain and they hear his voice. And Peter's like, "Oh, let us build, 3 tents for you and Moses and Elijah." And he struck dumb by that. So let's continue on, though. Miracles. Is everybody still with me? Just a few more slides.
Yeah.
Barely.
So we have the miracles of Jesus. They serve several functions to fulfill Old Testament prophecies, an invitation to believe in his message and in his ministry. They were also a way in which Christ brought judgment upon a largely unbelieving Jewish nation, and also to confirm his identity as the divine Messiah. So there are a number of notable miracles throughout both the Synoptic Gospels as well as the Gospel of John. The turning of the water into wine at the wedding of Cana, the healing of the official son, the miraculous catch of the fish, I will make you fishers of men, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, the cleansing of the lepers, the healing of the paralytic, the calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee, where, he's walking on the water, the feeding of the 5,000, also the feeding of the 4,000, the healing of the man born blind, the raising of Lazarus, and then healing of blind Bartimaeus, among many, many others. You also think about the woman who had the, long period of blood flow, and, she touched his cloak, and, there was a miracle there. So there are many, many, many miracles, and they're ultimately to attest who Jesus really is. Jews seek for a sign, Greeks for wisdom, but to us, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God, as the Apostle Paul says. And so here's the 2 fish here, and here's the loaves of unleavened bread. Does anybody know what the Hebrew word for unleavened bread is? Has anybody heard of matzah bread?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Hebrew word for unleavened bread is matzah, which is where we get our term matzah bread. So here's our matzah right here, the unleavened bread, and here's the 2 fish. And Christ fed 5,000 people with this amount of food. So clearly miraculous. In addition to his miracles, we have many teachings and sayings of our Lord. As a Jewish rabbi, and he is called a rabbi, John chapter 1, verse 38, and Matthew chapter 26, rabbi or rabboni, as his disciples would have said in Aramaic. they saw him as their rabbi. I mean, he's ministering in this very Jewish context. And so he has many sayings that have both practical as well as timeless application, but also taught deep truths. So some of his famous sayings: do unto others as you'd have them do to you. But I tell you, you are to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Do not judge, or you will be judged. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And while there's clearly an air of rabbinical type, teaching within his sayings, these exceed the morality and they exceed the ingenuity of his contemporary rabbis and even the greatest rabbis in Jewish history. They would say, don't harm others. Don't do unto others as you would not have them do unto you, was a famous saying of Hillel, I believe. It was either Hillel or Shammai, one of the great, Pharisaical teachers a generation prior to the time of Christ. But Jesus does the positive. He says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's a positive aspect to his teaching that is often lost in the very negative, don't do this, don't do that, teaching of the rabbis from the Pharisaic tradition. And so he's commending us not just to a life in which we don't do certain things, but what are we supposed to do, not just what are we supposed to not do, which had been what much of Judaism had devolved into. One of my favorite statements, it may be my favorite statement in all of Scripture from Jesus and his earthly ministries. There's only one statement from Jesus' earthly ministry that is found outside of the canonical Gospels. And so this is recorded nowhere else but in this one spot. And I think, as Schaff says, it is so characteristic of who Jesus is that we don't even doubt its authenticity. And sometimes we just skip over this. But in Acts chapter 20, Paul says this, when he's exhorting the Ephesian elders as he's getting ready to leave them to go to Jerusalem and then on to Rome to his trial. He says, remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. We don't know where Jesus said this in his ministry because we don't have it recorded anywhere else. But this is an authentic saying of Jesus that is captured outside of the Gospels, and it's in Acts chapter 20. And I think, as Schaff says, it's so characteristic of the character of the Lord that we don't even doubt it. And oftentimes we just skip right past this without even realizing that Paul is giving us a saying of Jesus that's not in the Gospels, that he actually said in his earthly ministry. And so, one of my favorite sayings. In the Gospel of John, there are the 7 I am sayings. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. These are obviously connected to the divine name in the Old Testament when Moses asks God in the burning bush, the angel of the Lord, who are you? He says, I am who I am. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, this is echoed in Isaiah 40 through chapter 48, where I am he, I am he. Jesus says the word I am, or the phrase I am, with no qualifier in John chapter 8, which recalls the Hebrew I am he. So in Greek, it would be ego eimi. In Hebrew, it would be ani hu, which is I am he. I'm the one who is coming. I'm the one who is spoken of by the prophets. And he's ultimately saying, I am God, by taking this title to myself. Not just any God, but your God, the God of the Old Testament, the divine name. Jesus is saying that's who he is. And so we also have his 7 sayings from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Woman, behold your son. And Behold your mother to John. My God, why have thou forsaken me? I thirst, it is finished, and Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so that takes us to the Passion. And so we're coming down to the end of the lesson. All four of the Gospels contain a Passion narrative. I love this quote from Bart Ehrman, of all people, who's the famous skeptic who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. Craig, there in your your state of North Carolina, formerly my state, there at the Chapel Hole, there in that cesspit of secularism and infidelity, known as the University of North Carolina. Of course, Duke is not much better, maybe worse than North Carolina. But here's Bart Ehrman. He says, one of the most certain facts of history, and he's saying, period, is that Jesus was crucified on the orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. And so this is an agnostic who's saying one of the single most certain facts in all of history is that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So for atheists who like to say that Jesus didn't exist, the sort of Jesus mythicist crowd, here's Bart Ehrman, a skeptic, shooting that down. For Muslims who say that Jesus was not crucified, but it only appeared that he was crucified, Bart Ehrman is laughing and saying, no, that's not what happened. So there are two dates that are traditionally put forward for Good Friday, on which coincidentally, the 14th of Nisan, which is the day of the Passover feast, from Exodus chapter 12 would have fallen on a Friday. And those are AD 30 and AD 33. So depending on when you believe Jesus was born, the two most candidate dates, if you want to take 4 to 6 BC, AD 30. If you want to take 1 AD, AD 33. On both of these years, the Passover day, which the Passover feast was an 8-day festival because you had the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Matzah feast, after the day of Passover itself. The actual day of Passover itself fell on a Friday. And so AD 30 and AD 33. So April 7th or April 3rd would be the traditional days of Good Friday. So the timeline to the lead up of the Passion, the Last Supper, which was a Pesach meal, or Pesach being Hebrew for Passover. They would have celebrated the evening, which would have technically been Friday. So you celebrate the night before the actual day, because for Jews, a day is from evening to evening. Whereas in Greco-Roman reckoning, it's from morning to morning. And that's significant in terms of how John, who's writing to a primarily Gentile audience many years later up in Asia Minor, is communicating these details versus Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are much closer to these details and are writing in more of a traditional Jewish reckoning of the days. The Last Supper and the betrayal by Judas happens on a Thursday night, which is the beginning of the Friday in the Jewish sense. There are the Jewish trials before the high priest Annas and his son-in-law Caiaphas, John chapter 18. And then he has his first trial before Pilate. And then after this first trial before Pilate, he is sent to Herod Antipas. And why would he be sent to Herod Antipas?
Because it was not the Roman, it was like province, right?
Yeah, so was Galilee a Roman province at the time of Jesus's Passion?
You said it was a kingdom.
It was a client kingdom.
Right.
So that means you have, prior to annexation, instead of directly taking over and administering a future province, the Romans would leave local rulers, local kings in place. So these local kings would be given Roman citizenship. They would essentially, some of them would attain senatorial rank, like Herod the Great did, but they essentially ruled as amici socii, so allied friends of, amici socii rex. So like a friendly king of the people of Rome would be like what their title was. And so these were technically not Roman provinces. They were client kingdoms. So they were under the authority of the Roman Empire, but they were not provinces. And so Pilate, who is in Jerusalem for the feast to maintain order, questions Jesus, and he finds out that Jesus is not from Judea. Jesus is from Galilee. And so Galilee was under Herod Antipas, one of the descendants of Herod the Great. I believe he was his grandson. And so he sends him to Herod in order for Herod, who was technically his sovereign, quote unquote, to be tried by Herod or to be interrogated by Herod. And so it says, before that day, Pilate and Herod hated each other. You can imagine a Roman governor who's next to a client king. There's trade and there's all sorts of stuff going across, between the client kingdom and the province. There's probably a lot of political, tension and intrigue that's going on. And so it said Pilate and Herod did not like each other. But after the trial of Jesus, it said they were friends from that day forevermore. So, just wicked men on both accounts. Herod then sends Jesus back to Pilate, who says, I find no guilt in the man. But the Jewish religious leadership continues to press, and they make this amazing statement. We have no king but Caesar. Does anybody know why this statement would be absolutely amazing, especially in light of last week's lesson?
Caesar wasn't a king.
Caesar wasn't a king. Exactly. He was the princeps. He was the first citizen. He was not actually a king. And so it is the depth of depravity is incredible here. We have no king but Caesar. This would have never been said in Italy.
Time, Richard?
What was that?
Like they had, the people of that time that were Roman citizen and whatnot, they understood that Caesar was not a king, correct? Like that was common knowledge.
He was the princeps. He was the first citizen of the Republic. Okay. Because even though we call it the Roman Empire today, in their day, the people would have still seen it as the Roman Republic.
But to the Jewish people, they had a history of kings in their heritage. So they associated a singular ruler to a king, and they used a term that fit to them, but was not really what the Roman culture would call them.
Yeah, right. These men, I don't think were ignorant. I think they knew what they were saying. And it's rather, it's a galling.
They also said they were never slaves to anyone, which is hilarious. If you read Exodus, right?
Yeah. So Pilate then, being the very cowardly, flip-floppy politician that he is, he's totally a spineless, a man who had killed a lot of people. He'd gotten on the bad side of Tiberius. He was losing control of the province, and so he was kind of under the magnifying glass. And so Tiberius was waiting for Pilate to screw up. And now all of a sudden Pilate, he's become, a byword for a cowardly politician. So he then relents to the mob and hands Jesus over for crucifixion. And so there's the timeline of the crucifixion. We could get into all these details. Jesus is nailed to the cross, thieves on either side at 9 a.m., 9 to 12. The soldiers mock him. Onlookers are jeering. Jesus speaking to Mary and John. 12 p.m., which is the 6th hour of daylight, darkness falls over the land. And then at 3 p.m., that's the 9th hour, Jesus cries out and dies. An earthquake shakes the ground and the temple curtain rips. After the crucifixion, you have the burial. Jesus is taken down from the cross after it was shown that he was already dead. He was taken down by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who were both members of the Sanhedrin, but they were secret disciples of Jesus. And so they buried him in a temporary tomb belonging to Joseph. And so Schaff gives a summation of Jesus's birth, 4 to 5 BC, his baptism, 27 AD, the length of his public ministry is 3.5 years, and he assumes that the crucifixion took place on the 7th of April, which is a Friday, the 15th of Nisan, on 7 in the year 783, according to the reckoning of the building of the city of Rome. Here's a couple of artifacts that we have. This is the Pilate stone, which is external corroboration for the existence of Pilate. He's actually called the prefect here. Tacitus actually misnames his gubernatorial title. He was a prefect, not a procurator. Prefect being a military governor, a procurator being more of a civilian tax-gathering governor. Here's the tomb of Jesus, traditionally in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then here's the entrance to the garden tomb, which is an alternate site to the burial place of Jesus. So the resurrection. From Schaff, we just have 2 more slides. The Christian church rests on the resurrection of its founder. Without this fact, the church could never have been born, or if born, it soon would have died a natural death. The miracle of the resurrection and the existence of Christianity are so closely connected that they must stand or fall together. If Christ was raised from the dead, then all his other miracles are sure, and our faith is impregnable. If he was not raised, he died in vain, and our faith is vain. The resurrection of Christ is therefore emphatically a test question upon which depends the truth or falsehood of the Christian religion. It is either the greatest miracle or the greatest delusion which history records. Powerful words from Schaff. And so there's 4 views. There's the historical view, which this is the traditional view of a physical bodily resurrection of the Lord, and Schaff goes through these views. As a miraculous but real, tangible miracle, Christ's soul was reunited with his body, and he rose body and soul from the grave, never to die again. There's the theory of fraud, which is that the apostles stole and hid the body of Jesus and deceived the world. This is first come up with by the Pharisees and repeated by later opponents of Christianity. There's the swoon theory, which was proposed in kind of the early modern era, that maybe Jesus didn't really die, but was seriously wounded and restored to health by his friends. That doesn't make sense considering that the pericardial fluid would have flowed out behind the blood. So blood and water, as John writes in John chapter 5, the spirit, the water, and the blood are the testimony. And then there's the vision theory that Christ merely arose in the imagination of his friends. This is a favorite of skeptics today, and it was first put forward, though, in the 2nd century by Celsus, who is a powerful, not powerful, was an early opponent of Christianity. And we'll save this for the end. What are the problems with the final 3 hypotheses? We can certainly talk about that. But I want to get to the ascension, and then we'll close. So there are 2 primary accounts of the ascension. There's really one if we consider Luke and Acts, 2 volumes by the same author. There's Luke chapter 24, 50 through 53, and there's Acts chapter 1, 1 through 10. The longer ending of Mark also contains an account, but this is dubious. We'll get into that later when we talk about the New Testament. Jesus appears to his disciples over a period of 40 days, both in Galilee and Jerusalem. He then led his disciples to the Mount of Olives and ascended into heaven at the right hand of the Father. And as the Nicene Creed says, from thence he shall come to judge the living and the dead, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. And here's an aerial view of the Mount of Olives today. So I'll stop sharing. And questions before we end tonight. Thank you all for holding on. I thought this would be a shorter one, and it is slightly shorter than last week, but still a lot to cover. Everybody still with me?
Yeah.
That's great. Any takeaways? Anything that you learned that was new, or questions that you have that were brought up by the lesson?
I like that one about Gates of Hell Not Prevail. That's a new one.
Yeah, Caesarea Philippi, the cultic worship of the pagan deity of Pan, which there's a lot of very, shall we say, risque details into how the cultic practices around the Pan cult there in uh, um, Caesarea Philippi would have worked. Let's just say maybe it's connected in some way to the Livingston Parish Library meeting that we had tonight. um, Sort of the same. Let's just say that bad library books would have been the least of our problems in the ancient world if we were confronting the pagan culture around us. I'll just put it to you that way.
He was depicted in the last Olympics. I think it was France with their poor
Yeah,
taste in entertainment.
yeah. Pan was a fertility deity.
Yes.
You can imagine what that would involve in the ancient world prior to the time of Christianity.
Wasn't he associated with like mischievousness as well?
Yes. Yeah, and I think that goes back to Greek mythology where, he like deceived a maiden or something like that. And I don't know how
Yeah.
Pan is connected to Zeus. I think he's like one of the sons of Zeus. But I mean, that's a common theme that you see in especially Greek mythology, the sort of specifically Greek. Less, it's de-emphasized somewhat in the Roman sort of Greco-Roman religion, the Roman sort of, iteration of that same Greco-Roman religion. But yeah, especially in the Greek East, a lot of bad stuff.
Mm.
The Jews and the Greeks, as we discussed before, there is an immense hostility. The Jews saw the Greeks as revolting, pagan homosexuals and all sorts of, just revolting, vile, pagan, practices. And the Greeks, who had philosophy and high culture, saw the Jews as basically a bunch of backwards, hayseed rubes who were violent and always on the edge of revolt. And so Greeks and Jews definitely there's not a lot of love lost. So the fact that the apostles go out, and we'll talk about this in the apostolic age over the next month or so. The fact that they went out into the Greek speaking world, it's one of those miracles of history that God would providentially work in that way, and that we have the New Testament recorded in Greek. Certainly God's providence, and it's a strange way in which the Lord would work. What did y'all think of you know, the timelines with like, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, 46 years since the building of this temple? Is Does that seem sort of, wild that we could potentially actually get to some of these dates in history, that this is not just, wild conjecture, but we can have a pretty good idea of when these events happened?
I find that especially interesting because, I mean, personally, when I've taken history classes in high school and college, you know, in college especially, there's no church association with any of it. And so it's very much like a separate study when these things are all intertwined with one another. And that's just, to your point, like evidence of it. And so I'm having to like kind of reframe my own mind to include all these timelines together because they are together. But I think it's just like academically separated, unfortunately. So I'm having to kind of make up for that.
Yeah, it used to not be that way.
Right.
It's really only since about the 19th century that
Hmm.
it's been that way.
And I went to a private Christian school my entire, elementary to high school time. And there really, even there, wasn't an emphasis on it. For example, in a world history class in high school, we did start in Mesopotamia, but it was an incredibly short study, and really, really did not do the Lord any justice, unfortunately, in proclaiming His entire plan. Mostly because I think that the teacher just wasn't equipped that way to teach. He himself was more of an agnostic. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's we've lost a lot in the past couple of centuries, ever since the 19th century and the rise of skepticism generally, and the secularization, the process of secularization of our society. And I think that's one of the reasons I sent that video about Tom Holland, where it's like he's wrestling with the fact that these are not just fairy tales, these are not just fables, but there's a deep historical substratum that underlies the gospel narratives and what we see in the New Testament. And whether one wants to accept the miraculous character, the supernatural elements of the story, that's one thing. But to say that it's completely made up, like the Jesus mythicists, is just, I mean, that is intellectually dishonest. And
Yeah.
I think the Bart Ehrman quote I find just astonishing. Here is
Well,
an
that one
agnostic.
connects back to your first page, right? That quote from the enemy of Christians that were describing Christians, and it included testimony to crucifixion.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like kind of like is one of the many different attestations include, but also for us as believers, the scriptures settle it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that it's kind of interesting how sometimes somebody who's a pagan, who's not at all sympathetic to Christians, and Tacitus, like the fact that he records this story as a hostile source, is I think it's rather remarkable, because in his hostility, he's actually, and he's not as hostile. I mean, there are degrees of hostility. He's a pagan Roman. He thinks this is some sort of weird, Judean cult that's come into the city of Rome, along with all these other weird cults that have come into the city of Rome. And so he's just kind of an elitist, guy. But him recording the fact that they call themselves Christians, that they, worship this guy named Christus, and, that this superstition came out of Judea under Pontius Pilate is, I think, pretty incredible. So, all right. Well, y'all go have a good Tuesday night.